Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th hour, helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Now, in this week's news for the week of June 20th to 26, 2021, the New York City mayoral primary came and went with Eric Adams in the lead, but now the ranked choice ballots have to be counted. Cuomo officially ended New York's COVID emergency declaration. Biden reached a bipartisan deal on infrastructure but quickly endangered it. A January 6th commission will be created after all, while Republicans filibustered a voting rights bill in the Senate, and the Supreme Court protected the right to curse off school grounds. Now onto the show. Things may have changed by the time you hear this, starting with the Blasio. Small businesses hurt from the pandemic can now use the New York City Business Quick Start program, an $11 million program that apparently gives businesses a one-stop shop to navigate regulations, a 48-hour response time, and cut processing time by half. The city expects 50,000 businesses to take advantage of the program. The final week of the Democratic mayoral primary got heated as Adams tried casting an alliance between Garcia and Yang as racist in an attempt to suppress voting, while he himself cast doubt on the ranked choice voting system, even invoking poll taxes to paint a picture, and spurring concerns that Adams is laying the groundwork to challenge the results if they don't come out in his favor. Yang had to remind Adams that he too is a person of color when Adams said that Garcia and Yang were trying to sideline a person of color from being mayor. While Yang was openly telling his supporters that he would like them to rank Garcia as number 2 on their ballots, Garcia refused to make the same announcement for Yang to her supporters. And other candidates like Wiley rejected Yang's invitation to campaign together because of his comments concerning those with mental illnesses at the last debate. A volunteer for Adams' campaign was stabbed in the Bronx at the start of the week. Despite Adams claiming he sold his Brooklyn co-op to a friend in 2007, there is no record of the sale, and recent evidence emerged showing he was co-owner of the co-op for the past 6 months. The co-op hasn't been reported on any of Adams' financial disclosure forms during his time as state senator or Brooklyn Borough president. There's no evidence of Adams paying a gift tax if it was really transferred to his friend Sylvia Cohen, and Adams continued to live in the co-op until 2013, 6 years after the alleged sale of the Prospect Place co-op. When Cohen tried selling the co-op in 2017, Adams intervened according to the real estate agent who attempted to broker the deal. From 2017, Adams apparently moved to a bedroom apartment in a building he claimed rental income from, but then claimed to reporters his rental income was offset by renovations on the building, even though he never filed tax forms reflecting as such. Adams gave a tour of the basement apartment to reporters who noticed questionable things such as meat in his fridge — Adams is a vegan — and the lack of a tub in his bathroom when Adams said taking baths is one of his favorite downtime activities. Speculation exists as to whether Adams actually primarily lives with his partner in a Jersey apartment. Adams was also under fire for not disclosing the use of space inside the law firm of Abrams Fensterman, where Adams dialed into several fundraisers from, and didn't disclose the use of the law office space or having paid for it. The City Board of Elections briefly came under fire at the start of the week after one of Yang's pollsters got their hands on early voting data, which the City Board said is accessible to other campaigns, they just didn't know it. An Ipsos poll released the day before primary day had Adams at 28%, followed by Yang at 20% and Garcia at 15%. While Adams enjoyed being in the lead with a plurality of first-choice votes, he didn't have a majority of second and third choices on voters' ballots, which could endanger his candidacy if he didn't win outright in the first round, which he didn't. The full election results won't be known until mid-July. After the first night of the primaries, data for the first round of balloting revealed Adams on top with 31%, Wiley with 22%, Garcia at 19%, Yang at 11%, and Stringer at 9%, with the rest of the field even lower. Yang gave a concession speech, saying that he didn't foresee the math helping him after numerous ranked choice voting rounds, although his campaign did file a lawsuit to reserve the right to fix any issues with erroneous ballots.
There's so many people I owe an incredible debt to for the success and impact of this campaign. But you all know I am a numbers guy. I'm someone who traffics in what's happening by the numbers, and I am not going to be the next mayor of New York City based upon the numbers that have come in tonight. I am conceding this race, though we're not sure ultimately who the next mayor is going to be, but whoever that person is, I will be very happy to work with them to help improve the lives of the 8.3 million people who live in our great city. And I would urge everyone here to do the same.
Garcia and Wiley promised to hold on while Adams prevented 2 reporters that wrote tough pieces against him from entering his election night party.
We know there's going to be 2s and 3s and 4s. We know that. Right. But there's something else we know.
Take your time.
That New York City said our first choice is Eric Adams.
I have been out there talking to voters, and they so desperately want things to be better. They want to see us come back strongly, to see art and culture and restaurants, but they're hurting, and we are going to have to do a lot of work on small businesses. We're going to have to do a lot of work about kids who have been traumatized by being on Zoom school, or perhaps worse, having lost a parent or guardian. We're going to have to make real investments.
I don't know what New Yorkers have chosen tonight. Not any one of us do, because the votes are still being counted. I will tell you what is true. Every single vote will count.
Republican Curtis Sliwa decisively defeated Fernando Mateo for the Republican mayoral nomination. During the voting, de Blasio was still not revealing who he voted for, with reports indicating that he made up his mind moments before casting his ballot. The mayor continued to dodge questions about him voting for Adams first, but made comments the day after the primary, giving kind words about the frontrunners in the race, saying he feels, quote, satisfied. The New York Times reported that it is unlikely either Wiley or Garcia can catch up enough to erase Adams' lead in the race, pointing to independent ranked choice simulations, exit polling, and historical examples of other ranked choice elections in other cities that show those running behind first place rarely displace the first ballot leader. Adams must be riding high on the same sort of information, as the Brooklyn Borough president went on an ostensible victory tour around the city, calling himself the new face of the Democratic Party and urging the mayor for a quicker transition than before November's general election. Not to miss his chance to make comments about the New York City primary, Governor Cuomo said on Wednesday that he essentially can't wait for a different mayor, as de Blasio was, quote, hyper-partisan and incompetent, and may have tipped his hand a bit when he had good things to say about Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, who the governor called, quote, competent, and said he had a good relationship with Adams from his time in the Senate. Cuomo had nice things to say about the other candidates as well, but clearly made the point that he's ready for change in the city. Just a reminder that Cuomo is facing investigations for covering up nursing home deaths and 10 sexual assault/harassment allegations. In other races, the candidates for comptroller faced off in their last debate at the start of the week, including Council Speaker Corey Johnson, Councilman Brad Lander, former CNBC anchor Michelle Caruso-Cabrera, State Senators Brian Benjamin and Kevin Parker, Assemblyman David Weprin, Financial Advisor Reshma Patel, and former Marine and mayoral candidate Zach Iscol. Lander and Caruso-Cabrera, running behind Johnson, went after Johnson's handling of budget negotiations with de Blasio, who defended himself by pointing out Lander went along with him on those negotiations, and went after Caruso-Cabrera for being a former Republican who failed to beat AOC, who didn't say what she herself would cut from the budget. The state lawmakers pointed out how they passed increased funding for students throughout the state, and Johnson publicly vowed not to run for mayor after he'd done being comptroller, as the position usually leads to the office holder running for mayor. After the end of the primary, Councilman Brad Lander surprisingly held the lead over Speaker Corey Johnson, 31 to 22%, with Michelle Caruso-Cabrera at 13%. The race for Manhattan DA, which isn't subject to ranked choice voting rules because it's a statewide office, saw former Chief Deputy Attorney General Alvin Bragg leading former Department of Justice Prosecutor Tally for Hardy and Weinstein 33 to 30, with both leaders holding out to see how the absentee ballots are going to go. For the borough president races, Councilman Reynoso is in the lead in Brooklyn, followed by Councilman Carnegie and Assemblywoman Joanne Simon running neck and neck behind him. In Manhattan, Councilman Mark Levine is running neck and neck with State Senator Brad Hoylman. In Queens, incumbent Donovan Richards and former Councilwoman Elizabeth Crowley are running virtually tied. In the Bronx, Councilwoman Vanessa Gibson is running ahead of fellow Councilman Fernando Cabrera. In Staten Island, Democratic businessman Mark Murphy is running in the lead in his primary, but the Republican primary is seeing a tighter race with disgraced former Congressman Vito Fossella and Councilman Stephen Mateo. The City Board of Elections said that final results for the election won't be known until mid-July, as absentee and military ballots roll in over the coming weeks and ranked choice ballots are going to be carefully counted. Total turnout for the election seems to have surpassed 2013 levels. The Education Department is reversing a plan to increase the price of using public school buildings after after-school programs said it's become too expensive to run their activities. Prices are going to go back to pre-pandemic levels. Yellow bus service for homeless and disabled students are being expanded for summer school classes, but with the hang-up of there being no plan for the ride back home after school. Education Department officials said that homeless students can request a MetroCard for transportation back home, and that bus service back home couldn't be provided due to, quote, operational constraints and safety considerations. The COVID positivity rate in schools is 0.03%, leading the mayor to say that the virus is almost non-existent in the school system. The Civilian Complaint Review Board named 39 officers to be disciplined for their role in the George Floyd protest last summer, substantiating 26 complaints against them. Departmental charges were recommended for 14 officers, B-level command discipline against 7 cops, and the lowest penalty against 17 cops. The CCRB also said that it would potentially investigate claims made by whistleblower cops that filed a lawsuit in 2015 alleging that a racial quota was being imposed on them. If the whistleblowers are able to show in court that not going along with quotas hurt their careers, the CCRB will be able to invoke their charter's mandate and look into racially biased policing. The investigation would be hampered by sealed police records, which the state legislature has to make available. Staying true to the city's efforts to expunge low-level marijuana records following the legalization of marijuana throughout the state, Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz petitioned the court to dismiss more than 3,200 marijuana offenses. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York created a new department dedicated to environmental crimes, including child-led exposure, air pollution, and water and wetland protections. The office was created after President Biden's executive order for federal agencies to look into environmental justice. A bust of George Floyd installed just last week was vandalized by a white supremacist organization, with the suspects spray painting the statue and leaving the group's name. According to several sources with knowledge of the matter, the Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance told attorneys representing the Trump Organization that his office is considering filing criminal charges against the corporation and its CFO, Alan Weisselberg, as soon as next week. The MTA said that service cuts to the B, D, N, Q, and R lines are being extended into November 2022 in order to give trains carrying construction workers more access to the Sunset Park rail yard. Scooter rideshare company Revel is crying foul after the Taxi and Limousine Commission voted down Revel's efforts to have an all-Tesla electric vehicle ride-sharing service a day before their vote was actually scheduled, citing traffic congestion. The TLC said the past tense language in their statement was a red herring. Revel said that it's going to launch its all-Tesla ride-sharing service anyway. The mayor commented on a staff shortage at the MTA, saying that it could imperil New York City's recovery from the pandemic as trains come back to their pre-pandemic operations. More than 5,300 trains were canceled from June 1st to 18th due to staff shortages, more than 4 times the amount of last June. MTA interim president Sarah Feinberg confirmed the riders will face delays. De Blasio also announced that the Staten Island Ferry will be returning to its twice-hourly level of service, which was cut during the pandemic. Workers sitting in subway booths will no longer handle cash or swap out damaged MetroCards, announced MTA officials, making the COVID change permanent, saying the new Omni system makes the status quo obsolete. Riders can still use cash at vending machines, which will also be replaced by Omni machines. A pilot program letting accessoride passengers hail cabs instead of wait for the usually late disability vehicles is back to a pre-pandemic 70% operational level, but is still hampered by lack of drivers. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board approved a 1.5% increase in the second half of rent-regulated one-year leased apartments inhabited by 1.2 million New Yorkers, an apparent compromise between tenant advocates who wanted to freeze rent and landlords who wanted to increase it by a more sizable amount. A neighborhood meeting regarding de Blasio's rezoning of Soho in Manhattan turned chaotic as residents shouted and interrupted a sitting planning commission hearing about the plan seeking to create 3,500 new apartments, which would reserve 900 of them for the label of affordable. Brooklyn's Community Board 6 approved a measure to rezone the Gowanus neighborhood, another one of the more controversial rezonings happening around the city, but under the condition that the city set aside a number of affordable housing units and new rental development, funding outstanding NYCHA projects as well as appointing a liaison to oversee them, conducting a racial impact study on the rezoning, and more. 100 electronic charging ports and more are being installed by the city in order to transition to a future filled with more electric vehicles. Over at the City Council, City Limits took note of 14 City Council candidates throughout the 5 boroughs out of 300 people in total who have raked in more than $100,000 in private contributions, including Rafael Salamanca, Carlina Rivera, Speaker Corey Johnson, Chief of Staff Eric Botcher, and Tiffany Caban, who failed in her last attempt to become Queens' new district attorney. The City Council has been in budget negotiations with de Blasio, with sources saying talks will be done before the end of the month deadline. De Blasio had pitched a $98.6 billion budget proposal in April, the largest budget in New York City history. Over at the Cuomo administration, workers in group homes for the developmentally disabled aren't getting vaccinated at strong rates, according to the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities data. As of mid-June, just 33% of workers in group homes have received at least one dose. The governor announced this week that he was comfortable enough with the progress of the state's COVID recovery that he removed the emergency declaration he proclaimed at the start of the pandemic. CDC guidelines will still be adhered to, including the wearing of masks in transportation and hospital settings.
The emergency is over. It's a new chapter. Doesn't mean there's not challenges for the new chapter, but the emergency is over. The state of emergency that I had declared in consultation with Commissioner Zucker, a health emergency. It expires tomorrow. It will not be renewed. It will punctuate the expiration of the emergency that we have been in because New Yorkers rallied and essential workers rallied. Let's give everyone a round of applause.
Disappointing those who had hoped to make to-go alcoholic drinks a permanent fixture of post-COVID New York life, the state liquor authority said that the regulations that temporarily allowed that to happen lapsed. The governor's office said that state workers are going to have to report back to the office on a more regular basis with full staffing in offices by September 7th. Cuomo senior aide Rich Azzopardi was recently questioned by Attorney General Letitia James's investigators looking into Cuomo's sexual harassment allegations made by 10 different women. It wasn't clear what exactly was asked of Azzopardi or how advanced James's investigation was. Even though most of the attention was being paid to in the city, there were other races throughout the state. In Buffalo, a major upset was pulled off by Socialist community activist India Walton, who was a relative unknown in the race until months before the election. Walton unseats longtime incumbent Mayor Byron Brown, who refused to concede until absentee ballots were counted. While Brown projected confidence, Walton was hitting Brown during the campaign for his response to the COVID pandemic and for being under investigation by a federal grand jury for alleged pay-to-play schemes. Brown is thinking about launching a write-in campaign for the November general election. In Rochester, Mayor Lovely Warren was unseated by Rochester Councilman Malik Evans. That election was marred by controversy regarding Warren's handling of the Daniel Prude case, where Warren Prude was killed by police who put a spit bag over his head during a mental health episode, asphyxiating him. Warren blamed the police chief on suppressing information, leading to his ouster, but Warren herself came under fire for lying about what she knew about the information and when she took action. Warren's estranged husband was also arrested for gun and drug possession, injecting more controversy in the final hour of the election. Attorney General Letitia James, during a news conference announcing charges against 47 alleged gang members, said that 90% of the guns recovered from crime scenes in New York came from out of state, and that she doesn't believe bail reform, which prohibits the detention of most criminal suspects for not being able to pay bail, had anything to do with the rise in gun crimes. Cuomo signed a bill this week passed by the legislature into law that would allow New Yorkers to select an X on their driver's licenses and birth certificates to show a non-binary gender identification. Over at the state judiciary, because the legislature is now out of session, Lawrence Marks, the chief administrative judge for the state's unified court system, said the court system is sending Governor Cuomo a letter urging him to veto a bill that forces possible term limit extensions for judges who can be under investigation for sexual harassment, racism, or other improprieties. The Trump Organization has sued the city of New York, saying the city wrongfully terminated existing contracts with the Trump Organization to operate 2 Central Park ice skating rinks, the Central Park Carousel, and the Trump Golf Course at Ferry Point, with the golf course in contract set to originally end in 2032. State Supreme Court Justice Lawrence Love struck down a portion of the recently passed anti-chokehold law which bans certain police strangling maneuvers, seeking to prevent another episode similar to the death of Eric Garner. Love said the portion of the law called the diaphragm law, named after the banning of anything that would compress the diaphragm, is unconstitutionally vague, as it couldn't be readily defined. De Blasio said that the law department isn't going to appeal right away, but is instead going to look into rewriting the law to address the vagueness claimed by Justice Love. Former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Trump personal lawyer had his law license suspended by the New York State Appellate Division's First Judicial Department after the department's Attorney Grievance Committee argued Giuliani's false accusations in courts throughout the country that the 2020 presidential election was rigged against former President Trump were specious lies. Giuliani's lawyers argued the decision was unprecedented and promised an appeal. State Supreme Court Justice Rosemary Montalbano defeated Civil Court Judge Dwayne Esther Paul for the position of Brooklyn Surrogate Court Judge, landing a blow against the Kings County Democratic Party, who were rooting for Paul. Reformers backed Montalbano, who promised to end the practice of patronage associated with the office that deals with the estates of New York's loved ones. After a Texas judge dismissed the NRA's attempt to get out of a New York lawsuit, the National Rifle Association and Attorney General Letitia James battled in court again this week, with the Attorney General moving to dismiss the NRA's counterclaims. Over at the Biden administration, the Biden administration outlined where 55 million vaccines were going as part of a plan to send 80 million vaccines out to other countries for this month. 25 million vaccines have been shipped out. 41 million vaccines are going to COVAX, the WHO program overseeing vaccine shipments to poorer countries. 14 million are going to Latin America and the Caribbean, and 60 million are going to Asia and the Middle East. Biden had to concede that the goal of vaccinating 70% of Americans with at least one shot isn't going to happen by July 4th, saying the goal will take an extra few weeks because younger Americans are stubbornly refusing shots. A little over 65% of Americans have at least one shot, and 150 million Americans are fully vaccinated.
For all the progress we made as a country, hospitalizations and deaths are down drastically in places where people are getting vaccinated. The data couldn't be clearer. If you're vaccinated, you're safe. You are still at risk of getting seriously ill or dying if you, in fact, have not been vaccinated. That's just a fact. And this new dangerous variant continues to emerge. It's now the most common variant in America and here. And unvaccinated people are incredibly vulnerable. But it's more easily transmittable, this Delta variant, potentially deadlier, and especially dangerous for young people.
National Institutes of Health Director Dr. Anthony Fauci made it clear that the Delta variant is the greatest threat to the U.S. in terms of getting out of the pandemic now, with the new variant being 60% more infectious than the original COVID strain and steadily becoming the more dominant strain in the country, targeting those who are still unvaccinated. The Wall Street Journal's Amy Doxer Marcus, Betsy McKay, and Drew Hinshaw reported that according to the NIH itself, the public health organization deleted gene sequences for early COVID cases from the NIH's own sequence read archive database at the behest of Chinese researchers. The NIH justified the removal of the data by saying that the request came from the researcher who submitted it, thus they had the right to request its deletion. The gene sequences were from suspected COVID cases from January and February 2020. Although the deleted sequences don't change anything in terms of understanding where COVID came from, Jesse Bloom, a virologist at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle who discovered the deleted sequences and posted them online without peer review, said the situation underscores the lack of Chinese transparency when it comes to the pandemic. A working group from the CDC said that booster shots aren't necessary yet against COVID, yet public health officials have to be ready for the possibility for booster shots as the pandemic moves forward in the U.S. The CDC is also extending an eviction moratorium it put in place through July. The Public Health Agency instituted the moratorium through an old statute that gives the agency the authority to issue bans on evictions because of public health emergencies. Biden and a bipartisan group of 10 senators announced an agreement on a preliminary $579 billion deal in new federal spending on infrastructure, including roads, broadband, utilities, and more.
I said many times before, there's nothing our nation can't do when we decide to do it together, do it as one nation. Today is the latest example of that truth in my view. I'm pleased to report that a bipartisan group of senators, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, part of a larger group, has come together and forged an agreement that will create millions of American jobs and modernize our American infrastructure to compete with the rest of the world and own the 21st century. Let me be clear. Neither side got everything they wanted in this deal. That's what it means to compromise. And it reflects something important. It reflects consensus. The heart of democracy requires consensus. And this time a true bipartisan effort, breaking the ice that too often has kept us frozen in place, prevented us from solving the real problems facing the American people.
The deal only reflects a tiny portion of Biden's original pitch for an infrastructure proposal, which included what he called human infrastructure in his American Jobs Plan, including clean power and green energy measures, as well as universal elder care. However, in what can possibly calm down progressives, Biden said he won't pass the compromise bill without a separate reconciliation bill that could pass other planks of his American Jobs and Families Plan, which can run into obstacles if the Republicans filibuster their own compromise bill as a result. A government report found that 10 million Americans enrolled in Medicaid during the pandemic, putting the total number of Americans on the government-sponsored healthcare plan to 80 million. A new report from the National Center for Health Statistics at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention showed that births dropped by 4% between 2019 and 20, showing the pandemic made an already existing trend worse. The drop-off is the worst since 1973. Almost 30,000 asylum seekers whose cases were closed because of Trump's former Remain in Mexico policy will potentially be allowed to reopen their cases after the Biden administration rescinded the policy. After receiving a barrage of requests and criticism about Vice President Harris not visiting the southern border despite being tasked by Biden to look into ending the underlying reasons for surging migration into the U.S., Harris finally announced that she will visit, and she did, visit the border this week in El Paso, Texas, accompanied by Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas.
This has been a great trip to El Paso. As you all have heard me say many times, I strongly believe that most people don't want to leave home, and when they do, it is because either they are fleeing some harm or because to stay means that they cannot provide for the basic necessities of their family. That belief has been reinforced throughout our day today.
The Biden administration removed Rodney Scott from Customs and Border Patrol, who was a staunch defender of former President Trump and his border policies, in a move some say is the start of Biden's overhaul of Border Patrol. The amount of jobless claims came down to 411,000 last week after briefly ticking up 2 weeks ago, continuing a downward trend from 900,000 in January. A survey commissioned by the New York Times and conducted by the research firm Momentive found that 52% of Americans support halting federal unemployment benefits. 30% want the benefits to end when they're supposed to in September, and 18% want them to go on indefinitely. A common Republican talking point is that a big reason why employers can't find workers is because they're sitting on the $300 a week unemployment benefit. Personal spending in the U.S. stayed on the same level in May as inflation led to average consumer prices to increase. Biden pivoted his agenda away from infrastructure momentarily, although he facilitated another meeting with the coalition of senators looking for a bipartisan compromise this week, getting ready to make a speech about rising crimes in cities, as renewed focus on the issue had become a focal point in New York City's primary elections and other cities like Chicago and Portland. Ahead of Biden's speech, the Justice Department announced 5 strike forces that will target the flow of illegal firearms into places like New York City, Chicago, LA, San Francisco, and D.C. Biden is expected to allow cities to use pandemic relief funding to pay for community policing initiatives and zero-tolerance programs against gun traffickers.
Today, the department is announcing, as it just did, a major crackdown on stem the flow of guns used to commit violent crimes. It's zero tolerance for gun dealers who willfully violate key existing laws and regulations. Let me repeat, zero tolerance. If you willfully sell a gun to someone who's prohibited from possessing it, if you willfully fail to run a background check, if you willfully falsify a record, if you willfully fail to cooperate with the tracing requests or inspections, my message to you is this: we'll find you, and we will seek your license to sell guns. We'll make sure you can't sell death and mayhem on our streets. It's an outrage. It has to end, and we'll end it, period.
Attorney General Merrick Garland made good on his threat to protect voting rights. The Justice Department announced that it's filing suit against Georgia for the law restricting voting rights the state passed recently, alleging that the law discriminates against black people.
Today, the Department of Justice is suing the state of Georgia. Our complaint alleges that recent changes to Georgia's election laws were enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of black Georgians to vote on account of their race or color in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Several studies show that Georgia experienced record voter turnout and participation rates in the 2020 election cycle. Approximately 2/3 of eligible voters in the state cast a ballot in the November election, just over the national average. This is cause for celebration. But then in March of 2021, Georgia's legislature passed SB 202. Many of that law's provisions make it harder for people to vote. The complaint alleges that the state enacted those restrictions with the purpose of denying or abridging the right to vote on account of race or color.
The Federal Trade Commission announced that it will be reviewing Amazon's purchase of movie studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The FTC may be taking a hardline antitrust tack with the confirmation of its newest chairwoman, Lena Khan, a known big tech critic. The New York Times reported this week that according to internal State Department documents and sources familiar with the situation, 4 Saudis that killed journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Turkey received paramilitary training the year before in the U.S., made possible by State Department contract with private defense firm Tier 1 Group, owned by hedge fund firm Cerberus Capital Management. The report said there's no indication officials knew anything more about the Saudis, but shows how intertwined the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are in defense relationships. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are at odds with one another about overhauling the military sexual assault disciplinary system. Currently, the military handles sexual assault allegations internally, which critics say favors the accused due to a misogynistic and ableist culture. Advocates for reforming the disciplinary structure, such as Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, want independent military lawyers handling military sexual assault cases. Austin indicated his support for reform in a statement obtained by the Associated Press, while the Joint Chiefs wrote out their concerns in a letter responding to Senator Jim Inhofe, who hasn't backed Gillibrand's efforts. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who's also the first Native American cabinet member, announced an investigation into the effects of what are called indigenous boarding schools, which force Native American children to assimilate into white society. The investigation will also look into burial sites of Native American children that were forced into the boarding schools. A long-promised government report on what the U.S. knows about UFOs was finally released this week, saying that the government couldn't officially explain more than 140 cases of unidentified flying objects, but there also wasn't evidence of those objects being extraterrestrial. The good times for Russia between Biden and Putin might be coming to an end rather early, as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. is preparing more sanctions on Russia for the poisoning of dissident Alexei Navalny and chemical weapons use. The Biden administration put sanctions in place against Belarus in response to the recent stunt pulled by the Belarusian President Lukashenko to ground an airplane and pull out a political dissident under the guise of a bomb threat. A 6th round of talks in Vienna to get the U.S. and Iran to the negotiating table together to talk about removing sanctions in exchange for scaling back Iran's nuclear program ended up in no progress. Iran elected a new president last week, hardline Judge Ibrahim Raisi, who promised not to negotiate with Biden but supports negotiations to revive the 2015 deal. The Department of Justice also announced the blockage and seizure of several Iranian websites that allegedly spread disinformation in the U.S. The sites included one operated by the Arabic language Masira TV, which is run by the Yemeni Houthis, and Iran's Arabic language Al-Alam TV. A report conducted by the U.S. intelligence community concluded that the Afghani government can collapse as soon as 6 months after the U.S. fully retreats from the Middle Eastern country, owing in part to the strength of the Islamist fundamentalist Taliban, which has already started taking back parts of Afghanistan. Biden argued that the U.S. has already achieved its mission to go after those who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks in Afghanistan. A U.S. official told the USA Today that almost all U.S. troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan weeks ahead of the 9/11 deadline. The U.S. is going to help relocate Afghan interpreters that helped out the military as their applications are being processed. Interpreters are afraid that they're going to be targeted by the Taliban for helping the U.S. as soldiers withdraw. A week after Kim Jong-un told representatives in his government that North Korea should be ready for dialogue and conflict with the U.S. at the same time, the U.S. envoy for North Korea, Sung Kim, responded saying he's ready to meet with North Korea anywhere, anytime, without preconditions. Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, responded that the U.S. has the wrong expectations for a dialogue. Over in Congress, a bipartisan group of House and Senate lawmakers led by Democratic Representative Karen Bass, Republican Senator Tim Scott, and Democratic Senator Cory Booker announced an agreement for a framework on police reform. The details of the bill weren't expanded upon. Over at the House, Speaker Pelosi announced that she's going to move forward with a select committee in the House dedicated to looking into the origins of the January 6th insurrection incited by former President Trump. An earlier bipartisan measure was defeated in the Senate by Republican filibuster. Pelosi didn't divulge any details about who would be chosen to chair the committee or what kind of power Republicans would have on it.
This morning, with great solemnity and sadness, I'm announcing that the House will be establishing a select committee on the January 6th insurrection. Again, January 6th was one of the darkest days in our nation's history. I've said it now 3 times. It is imperative that we establish the truth of that day and ensure that an attack of that kind cannot happen, and that we root out the causes of it all. The Select Committee will investigate and report on the facts and the causes of the attack, and it will report recommendations for the prevention of any future attack. So we see this as complementary, not instead of, and hopeful that there could be a commission at some point.
The first person to have breached the Capitol building was sentenced this week. Indiana woman Anna Morgan Lloyd was sentenced to 3 years probation, a $500 fine, and 40 hours of community service. Morgan Lloyd pled guilty to one charge of parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building, and is the first of 500 rioters to have been sentenced. In statements that are court attempting to take responsibility, Morgan Lloyd said that she has since educated herself by watching movies recommended to her by her attorney, such as Schindler's List. Morgan Lloyd ended up downplaying the violence at the Capitol in interviews later by claiming that the insurrectionists were remaining quiet and weren't breaking anything, going back on her statements to the court. At a House Armed Services Committee, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the group of uniformed leaders in charge of the military, said that critical race theory is actually important to the military's intelligence, open-mindedness, and for the military to be widely read. In response to Republican questions about the subject, critical race theory is an academic concept from the 70s with the premise that racism is a social construct woven into American institutions and explains the systemic inequality facing minorities in this country. Republicans have been seizing on critical race theory as a wedge issue, with Republican legislatures seeking to ban the teaching of the concept altogether, like in Florida. An ambitious bill that seeks to threaten breaking up big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook if they don't take measures to improve competition in the market has passed the House Judiciary Committee this week 24-20, bringing it one step closer to the floor. The American Choice and Innovation Online Act would create new regulations against tech companies that would promote their own services over others, taking aim at a practice Google is known for, and also prohibiting big tech companies from buying each other out. House Democrats voted on restoring federal regulations curbing methane leaks, which were originally passed during the Obama administration, by using the Congressional Review Act for the first time, which allows Congress to get rid of specific federal regulations 60 days after it was finalized. In this case, it was a Trump-era regulation getting rid of the rules in the first place. The measure goes to Biden's desk for the president's signature. Over at the Senate, moderate Democrat Joe Manchin continues taking hits from Republicans for his list of compromises that would possibly allow him to support a Democratic voting rights bill, with Republican Senator Rob Portman calling it a federal takeover of elections. States are in charge of how they administer their elections, except Congress can set the terms of their elections for their offices. The compromises include declaring Election Day a public holiday, expanding early voting to at least 15 consecutive days, and banning partisan gerrymandering. Former President Obama commented on the voting rights bill, saying that it has to pass before the next election, pointing to January 6th, and saying that threats to our democracy will only get worse in the long term. When it came to finally vote to put the measure on the floor, Republicans blocked Democrats' attempts to break through the filibuster 50-50. 60 votes are necessary to break the filibuster and advance a motion to the floor of the Senate. Democrats vowed that the fight for voting rights isn't over, while Republicans defended their votes as defending states' rights and preventing a wholly partisan voting rights package. Rhode Island Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has undergone controversy this week for being a member of an all-white private beach club, despite promising to leave the club when he was campaigning years ago. Whitehouse said that he was no longer a member, but defended his family's membership by blaming the club, with Whitehouse saying that they told him that there is diversity in membership. The Senate passed a Bill 92-8 that would help farmers and foresters generate credits by cutting carbon emissions and carbon dioxide through their operations. The Agriculture Department would create a certification program that would allow the farmers and foresters to sell their credits for money, and private companies like Microsoft and McDonald's would buy the credits to offset their own carbon emissions. A companion House bill hasn't had any movement. Over at the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court continued releasing decisions this week, with the first up being a ruling on how college athletes are compensated by the National Collegiate Athletics Association, or NCAA, deciding in favor of the athletes. The decision upheld lower court injunctions on how the NCAA compensates athletes for their achievements, now allowing students to receive cash or similar benefits. The court also sided with a former Pennsylvania cheerleader who was kicked off her team for vulgar Snapchat messages that got back around to the school, ruling that Brandy Levy's high school violated her First Amendment rights for punishing her off-campus speech. Justice Clarence Thomas was the lone dissenter, saying that the ruling wasn't actually all that clear, since social media posts can proximately harm the school environment. SCOTUS also ruled against labor organizing on Californian farms, striking down a California law that allows labor unions to meet with farm workers on growers' farms despite the growers' objections. The 6-3 decision said that letting organizers go on farms amounts to a government taking, favoring property rights over labor organizing. The farms argued that the California law is outdated, as organizers can reach farm workers digitally now, whereas in the past it was reasonable to physically visit the hard-to-reach workers. The liberal justice's dissent pointed out that conservatives overruled 40 years of precedent where the Supreme Court originally rejected taking on a similar case before. The justices voted 7-2 in a case about the Federal Housing Finance Agency structure, where the director wasn't removable by the president. The court ruled that indeed the director is removable by the president, but the overall agency overseeing Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the federal mortgage loan programs that contributed to the 2008 economic crash, can stay in place. The majority also severed a lawsuit by shareholders in the programs that challenged the constitutionality of a 2012 agreement between the FHFA and the Treasury Department that reduced the shareholders' economic interests, sending the lawsuit back to lower courts. Following the ruling, the Biden administration confirmed that they're going to get rid of the current Federal Housing Finance Agency regulator Mark Calabria, who was installed by Trump and has called for the full privatization of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. In a unanimous ruling, the court ruled that police cannot enter homes during chases for minor crimes, saying it violates the Fourth Amendment to do so, and that cases will present separate fact patterns that justify such searches under a legal doctrine called exigent circumstances. The case revolves around a 2016 encounter between Californian resident Arthur Lang and Officer Aaron Weichert. Weichert followed Lang back to his home following Lang playing loud music and unexplainably honking his car while driving, and just as Lang closed his garage door, Weichert put his foot under it, preventing it from closing and entering the garage after Lang. Weichert made Lang blow a breathalyzer, revealing a positive blood alcohol result, but Lang argued that Weichert entered his property without a warrant originally for a noise complaint. In some rulings that didn't capture most of the attention, the court also reversed the long-standing class certification of plaintiffs that went after investment bank Goldman Sachs for general improprieties, with the court asking lower courts to consider more particular injuries necessary to certify a class. Another class certification that got slimmed down is the group of consumers injured by the TransUnion data leak, with the justices ruling that not every class member suffered concrete harm. The court also declared that the appointment of administrative judges by the Patent Trial and Appeal Board within the United States Patent and Trademark Office are unconstitutional, but said giving the director of the office control over judges' rulings would give the required constitutional check needed. In a separate case, the court overturned a 10th Circuit ruling ordering that small biofuel refiners can retain their exemptions from fuel blending requirements as required by federal regulators, and on Friday, the court also ruled that Native American corporations based in Alaska can qualify for American Rescue Plan funds meant for Native American tribes, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor writing the corporations are, quote, Indian tribes, regardless of whether they're also federally recognized tribes. Following an Inspector General's report that vindicated Trump from responsibility for clearing out Black Lives Matter protests from Lafayette Square in D.C. last June, where Trump took a picture holding a Bible in front of a church, it was thought that Trump directly cleared out the protesters for the photo op, but following the report, D.C. District Judge Dabney Friedrich dismissed most claims against Trump and former Attorney General Bill Barr in the lawsuits from the ACLU and Black Lives Matter. Judge Friedrich said the claims are too speculative in light of the new information. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals blocked the lower court ruling by Southern California District Judge Roger Benitez overturning California's assault weapons ban, who claimed the ban was unconstitutional and didn't have an effect on mass shootings, comparing AR-15s to Swiss Army knives. The Ninth Circuit stay leaves the ban in effect. The Second Circuit, based in New York, rejected a request by the group We Build a Wall, Inc. to unlock $1.4 million frozen in relation to charges the group was defrauding donors, claiming the money will be used to build Trump's southern border wall but were actually being pocketed by the group's leaders. Trump's former chief strategist Steve Bannon was charged as part of the group but was pardoned by Trump. The three other leaders of the group are awaiting trial. Federal District Judge Marshall Morales Howard in Florida ruled against a Biden-passed stimulus relief plan to forgive agricultural debts of black and other minority farmers. The program is meant to address inequities in government farming subsidies, but Judge Howard issued a preliminary injunction when the plaintiff, a white farmer named Scott Wynn of Jennings, Florida, argued he has debts also and is being discriminated against as he can't qualify for the program. There is a suit in Wisconsin as well, but this injunction is the first one to apply nationwide. In national news, Trump's former FDA chief Scott Gottlieb warned that if America doesn't vaccinate more people, then the rate of infection could reach as much as 20% of infections from last winter, particularly in southern states that have low rates of infections coupled with the spread of the more infectious Delta variant of COVID. According to the Associated Press, the vast majority of those who are now dying from COVID haven't been vaccinated, leading CDC Director Rochelle Walensky to say that nearly every death due to COVID at this point is entirely preventable. A new study by the Center on Society and Health at Virginia Commonwealth University found that the average life expectancy in the U.S. fell last year more than expected because of the pandemic, with the sharpest decrease in Black and Hispanic communities. Life expectancy dropped by 1.4 years on average for white Americans compared to 3.9 for Hispanic Americans and 3.25 years for Black Americans. Tropical storm Claudette ravaged Louisiana and other states in the south this past weekend, killing 13 mostly from a traffic pileup in Alabama that killed mostly children. A massive drought and heat wave hitting the western U.S. has given rise to wildfires across California, Colorado, Arizona, and Oregon, with meteorologists pointing out that this is the worst drought in American history. Las Vegas Raiders defensive lineman Carl Nassib has become the first active NFL player to come out as gay, saying that he was finally comfortable coming out and that he was agonizing over the moment for years. In news still revealing the silliness of the Trump administration, it was reported by the Daily Beast Asu Subsang and Adam Ronsley that Trump asked lawyers in 2019 about how the FCC and DOJ could investigate Saturday Night Live and other late-night comedy hosts for making fun of him, according to two sources familiar with the matter. A report published by the nonprofit Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington found that 881 Secret Service agents tested positive for COVID between March 1st, 2020 to March 9th, 2021, including 477 members of the division that provided security for Trump and former Vice President Mike Pence. A new report from Michigan State Senate Oversight Committee, which is led by Republicans, said that there was, quote, no evidence of widespread systematic fraud, end quote, within the state's electoral system in 2020, rebuffing Trump supporters that continue to spread the lie that Trump's loss was manufactured. After Texas Democrats walked out of the legislature denying Republicans a quorum to enact their voter suppression bill, Texas Governor Greg Abbott made good on his threat to dock legislators' pay and has now called a special session for July 8th, calling legislators back to the State House, giving Republicans another opportunity to pass the controversial measures. The bills would ban after-hours voting, prohibit ballot drop boxes, and drive-through voting centers, making it illegal for elections officials to send applications to vote by mail to people who didn't request one, and much more, with the measures rooted in false claims made by former President Trump that his election loss in 2020 was rigged with corruption. The founder of the computer antivirus software company McAfee, John McAfee, was found dead in his prison cell in Spain by suicide on Wednesday. McAfee was awaiting extradition to face severe tax-dodging charges in the U.S. that could have resulted in a 30-year punishment for the former software mogul. McAfee was known for being eccentric, escaping from supposed assassins, and being wanted in Belize for the murder of his neighbor. Pop star Britney Spears spoke in court for the first time about the conservatorship put in place, allowing her father to be in control of her life. Following some high-profile meltdowns, James Spears asked the judge to put a conservatorship in place which allows someone to be someone's guardian in financial and other matters. It turns out that for years Britney Spears opposed her conservatorship, but after some documentary shed light on the situation, she was only able to garner some power against it now. A 12-story luxury apartment building in Miami Beach, Florida partially collapsed, killing 4 and sending a frantic search for as many as 149 people who lived in the building. It wasn't immediately clear what led to the collapse, although there has been roof work going on for the past month, but Surfside Mayor Charles Burkett said that it was harder to imagine that being the cause. The New York Times reported that an engineer in 2018 warned the building had major structural damage underneath the pool deck, as well as cracking and crumbling of the underground parking garage's columns, beams, and walls. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was officially sentenced to prison this week after the judge denied his lawyer's attempts to request a new trial based on numerous claims, including jury bias and improper venue. Judge Peter Cahill ended up sentencing Chauvin to 22.5 years in prison, while crediting him about half a year for time already served. Chauvin, in a statement to the family of George Floyd, wished for them to find peace.
I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And that's it for this week's show of the 25th Hour, helping you stay on top of the 24/7 news cycle. Don't forget to rate us on Apple Podcasts, share us with your friends, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can email your tips and suggestions at the 25thhournews@gmail.com and become a patron today for as low as $2 a month to support the show at patreon.com/the25thhournews. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.